The first episode of the season sets a clear expectation that the audience should already understand every prior event involving these characters and locations, rather than using the opening to establish context. The show opens in motion, without narrative groundwork. A viewer with no external knowledge cannot determine the nature of Ahsoka's relationships, or the history that occurred before this point. The show bypasses traditional story entry points such as framing devices, internal reflection, or recap structure, and begins as if this were the second half of an ongoing narrative, rather than the start of a new one. Throughout the early episodes, the show repeatedly presents characters without providing internal motivation or sufficient narrative grounding. Ahsoka appears withdrawn and Sabine appears frustrated, yet the writing avoids establishing what caused that distance. The result is that the viewer receives reactions without reasons, action without context, and tension without setup standard. Visual storytelling rules suggest that if a story introduces conflict, it must support that conflict with information. Yet this structure is absent here, leaving the viewer without the data needed to interpret the scene. Rather than developing character stakes through in-scene problem-solving, Ahsoka Season 1 relies on prior audience familiarity to carry emotional weight. For example, when Sabine unlocks a major plot device, the narrative does not earn the significance. It assumes that viewers know why the device matters, how Sabine feels about it, and why the moment matters to Ahsoka. The script treats the viewer as someone already invested in specific emotional arcs and skips the foundational work that would build that investment. Ahsoka's characterization illustrates this lack of setup. She appears calm, reserved, and restrained, yet the show does not depict her internal reasoning behind that presentation. The absence of internal conflict removes the ability for the viewer to track character development, because no starting position is defined without a baseline. There is no measurable point of change. The show uses distance as a character trait, but does not justify that distance within the scenes. When the narrative attempts to create tension between Ahsoka and Sabine, it introduces their strain dynamic without showing how that strain developed. Scenes imply previous disagreements, but do not reveal them. The viewer is given an outcome, without the process that produced it. For an audience, storytelling process matters as much as story result. If a dynamic is broken, the viewer must witness either the fracture or enough supporting details to understand the fracture. Yet neither element is provided in the narrative. Sabine is positioned as a student in a mentor-student structure, yet the narrative does not show meaningful training decision-making or philosophical conflict scenes. Briefly reference that she is learning, but do not show learning taking place without demonstrating challenges, setbacks, or internal reasoning. The audience cannot evaluate the relationship, or the stakes training becomes a label rather than a narrative process. The pacing of the season reinforces the information gap. Long pauses, minimal dialogue, and extended shot duration slow the progression of plot material. However, these pauses do not reveal information about character motivation, nor do they accelerate tension, because they do not lead to discovery. A pause only gains value if it leads to understanding or change. Otherwise, it becomes empty. Runtime: the pacing stretches events without adding depth. Ahsoka. Season 1 frequently resolves scenes by using nostalgia rather than narrative logic. Characters appear that carry significance only because viewers may recognize them from other stories, but the show does not define their relevance for those who do not have external knowledge. In place of building stakes within the season, the show assumes stakes from prior material. The viewer is expected to bring emotional meaning rather than receive emotional meaning from the narrative. When new antagonists enter the narrative, they are presented with gravitas through silence and composition. However, gravitas does not replace development. Gravitas without motivation reduces antagonists to visual presence. Without strategic consequence to the plot, the lack of defined objectives limits the viewer's ability to track narrative structure goals, reveal stakes, and stakes drive tension. When goals are withheld, progress stalls. Section 1 reveals the core issue. The season relies on information not present in the season itself, when a narrative expects prior emotional investment. Instead of building its own foundational investment, it bypasses storytelling, fundamentals. The show leans on recognition instead of development, presentation instead of progression, and context instead of construction. Section 1 demonstrates that the season begins without narrative on ramps, leaving the viewer to assemble meaning that the story does not provide. A more effective version of the season would begin by grounding Ahsoka as a character rather than a symbol. The narrative would introduce her with a moment of decision that reveals her internal mindset, showing how her experience in the war shaped her current behavior, instead of presenting distance as a default state. The show could clarify why she chooses to operate alone and how her past informs her distrust of attachment. This would give viewers a clear emotional starting point and allow the rest of the story to measure change. Ahsoka's past with Anakin offers a clear internal conflict that the show could use to generate forward narrative motion. The audience understands that she carries unresolved experiences from leaving the Jedi Order and surviving a galactic war. Using that history to shape her choices would create depth rather than distance instead of silence. The narrative could show hesitation or analysis that reflects her evaluation of leadership responsibility. This would anchor her actions to internal reasoning rather than external mystery. Sabine's arc would benefit from establishing a defined personal goal for learning the Force. The current version assigns her a role without showing her decision process, which prevents the viewer from tracking her progress. If the narrative stated a measurable objective, such as mastering discipline, improving focus, or confronting personal fear, the audience could interpret each scene as progress or failure. Narrative momentum comes from evaluating change over time. Measurable goals allow that evaluation. The mentor-student relationship between Ahsoka and Sabine would strengthen if the season showed the disagreement that caused their separation, rather than referencing it. Scenes do not require emotional intensity to create impact. They require clarity. One structured conversation showing a difference in philosophy would build context and give the audience something to track. When the characters interact later in the story, conflict becomes meaningful only when the viewer understands what is being contested. The season introduces antagonists who carry visual authority but lacks clarity about their objectives. Clarity would increase narrative tension if Baylan and Shin articulated what they intend to achieve and why their path conflicts with Ahsoka. Then the audience could evaluate progress, and stakes. Tension does not emerge from mystery. It emerges from conflict rooted in defined goals without stated objectives. Narrative motion becomes observation instead of escalation. By defining antagonists with explicit objectives, the show could give every scene directional pressure. Scenes gain energy when two sides pursue measurable outcomes. If Ahsoka seeks to prevent a consequence and Baylan seeks to achieve it, then the viewer can interpret success or failure through scene results without that structure. Scenes become visual events rather than strategic movement, and pacing feels slower even when actions occur. A more effective structure would distribute information evenly across episodes, instead of revealing context at the end of arcs or assuming that prior media provided it. Each episode could contribute a new piece of understanding that helps the viewer evaluate relationships and stakes. Information flow is the engine of narrative when information is withheld. Without payoff, viewers wait rather than engage. The goal is not surprise, the goal is comprehension. To maximize emotional impact, the story could connect each character's decision to a theme. Ahsoka confronting legacy, Sabine confronting independence, and the antagonist confronting purpose. Linking choices to themes gives the story cohesion and ensures that scenes contribute to a larger idea without thematic linkage. Events appear sequential rather than consequential, creating the perception of stagnation even when plot movement is occurring. The season conclusion would strengthen if the narrative used resolution that reflects growth instead of relocation. The characters change location, but the show does not demonstrate that they have changed perspective or decision-making process. Narrative closure requires showing that characters view themselves or their goals differently. Ending a season with unanswered questions is acceptable. Ending with unchanged characters reduces narrative return value for the viewer. In summary, the season contains strong concepts and compelling characters, but the delivery relies heavily on prior knowledge and visual recognition rather than narrative construction. By focusing on defined goals, articulated motivation, and visible progression, the story could build tension from character reasoning instead of audience nostalgia, a version grounded in internal clarity rather than external reference would create stronger investment and provide a complete story within the season itself.
Thank you for watching. Be sure to like, subscribe, and hit that share button. My main channel is Critical Analysis Hub, where I post Star Wars content about the movies. My secondary channel is Critical Analysis Hub Plus, where I focus on the shows of Star Wars. And my third channel is Critical Analysis Hub XP, where I post comic books. Be sure to take a moment and check them out. Thanks, and may the Force be with you.